Bob, I'm super excited for our fantastic guest today. And also, Dr. Koutnik, I'm going to try my best to not just get lost in your voice because when I've heard you speak on other pods and such, I'm like, oh, your voice should be on the radio. You should be hosting all my podcasts. You have the best voice. But welcome to our show. Thank you so much.
Well, Dina, I appreciate that. No one's told me that before, but I'm going to take that for
What?
the rest of the day, and I'm just going to put it in my back pocket for whenever I need to feel better about myself. I'll
Totally.
remember that. So
I'm surprised no one's told you that because that's actually when you started talking, that's the first thing I was like, oh my God, he has such a nice radio voice, like deep and just
thank
mellow
you,
and-
Bob. I appreciate that from
right?
you too.
Yeah, I was like, wow,
No,
this is fantastic. Like you should
I've
go on the
honestly
road with that.
never-
Wait, you have gone on the
never
road.
heard
Yeah,
it.
never mind.
I've
I
never
was
heard that before, but I appreciate it.
So funny. Well, it kind of ties to one of our first questions, which is like for your career path. And I find your background and your, health situation very interesting, Dr. Koutnik. And I think since you didn't choose to go into radio broadcasting or any of that media broadcasting at this point anyway, you've shared on other forms of media your experience and living with type 1 diabetes. And then with your extensive research and the areas in which you focus, I was curious for our listeners if you could share a little bit more about your health journey and then how you kind of found your way to this area of work that you're focused on.
Yeah, sure, Genius. So I grew up like I guess most people grew up, but the one thing that was a little bit different is that I started developing obesity in childhood. And this was interesting to me because it wasn't from a lack of activity, by the way. I was very active, played football, I played baseball. Every day I was out in the front yard with my friends. We'd ride bikes, sometimes up to 2 miles per day. And, but I was still gaining more and more weight. And obviously that was a nutritional thing, not a lack of exercise thing. And over time, I eventually did become clinically obese. I did gain weight. I did fall into the category of obesity. And what was interesting is that I had tried so many different things to lose weight over that period of time and struggled. And so I had this really keen awareness at this pivotal point in my life of like, man, this is what it feels like to hold excess weight, the self-esteem, the just the energy levels, all these other things at such a pivotal, emotionally engaged part of your life. And it did affect me a lot, quite a bit actually. And I tried so many things to lose weight and just felt like I could never do it. And honestly, the most important thing that actually allowed me to eventually become successful was I just eventually had some consistency. I was lucky enough in that my parents saw the opportunity to get some outside help and actually had someone who just nothing fancy, just a typical diet coach, which I feel kind of like lucky in retrospect, like, man, like not everyone has access to something like that. And nothing over the top or crazy, but just someone who kept me accountable. And that really helped me get past a lot of the moments of struggle because I knew I was going to show up every single week and be accountable. And it was the accountability factor that really mattered for me at that stage. And I eventually ended up losing weight. And about a year after losing all that weight, I was on a family trip in Washington, D.C. with my family, as a kid in high school. And I'm, think why you go to Washington, D.C. Well, I was actually interested to learn about American history. I actually was fascinated to learn. It was interesting how much just like the journey to weight loss and trying to improve my own health actually improved my mental health and the way I thought about learning and becoming better. Like everything changed from that. And it's not an uncommon thing when people start getting heavily engaged in exercise in their pursuit of a challenge of some sort in their life, typically for their own health. It really is transformative across almost every aspect of your being, how much it can affect other components of your life. But a year removed from that on this trip to Washington, D.C., I was so pumped about. Before I got on the airplane, I started feeling like this irritation in my stomach that rapidly progressed into like, oh, I'm about to get on the airplane, I'm going to throw up. And so what do? Well, there's obviously the old tale that if you have sugar in your stomach, that it should help calm all those GI issues. And so I got a Gatorade and I got a Sprite and I drank those, not knowing at the time that my body was actually undergoing an autoimmune attack to kill the most important tissue that produces the most powerful hormone in all of the body called insulin. And that insulin is what is actually going to take glucose and put it into tissues. But now I was overloading my system with even more glucose, inadvertently not knowing this was happening, thinking it was going to prevent or reduce the symptoms, even though I was essentially throwing gasoline on top of a quickly burning fire. And so obviously it didn't help.
Yeah.
But I still ended up getting on the plane. Time actually helped. Being in the air conditioning, not moving, other components, just the fatigue I was feeling, I started to feel like just a little bit better. But what's interesting at this point in my life through my journey with obesity is I became very, very, very active. Now, I said I was always active, but it became like religion to me. Like I loved it. I breathed it. I practiced it. I tried everything to optimize it. And so I was a pretty fit person at this stage after my journey with obesity, relatively speaking. And I would go for 30 minutes of a walk and I would plummet to a level of fatigue I had honestly never felt in my life. And what I was realizing at this stage is that my body's inability to produce insulin, the hormone that allows for storing key nutrients that you consume in the body, was essentially not being produced at all. And as a result, my body was not able to regulate any energy appropriately. And as a result, I was rapidly deteriorating. My body was quickly breaking its own tissues down. And before I knew it, I threw up one evening for 14 hours straight. My mother called my grandmother, who's a nurse. I got shuttled from the hospital staff, or sorry, the hotel we were staying at staff actually took me to the hospital. And I was in the ER and they pricked my finger. The doctor comes back around 10 minutes later and says, Andrew, your blood sugar is 596.
Oh my God.
You have type 1 diabetes and we're going to send you to the intensive care unit to stabilize you. And I'm like, I don't even know what this means, but I kind of just want to go home and play video games. Like, I had no idea the transformative impact living with type 1 diabetes would have. But what it meant is that I was going to have to now manually control my metabolism for the rest of my life. I was going to have to know everything that entered my body, all the activity I was doing. How did the type of activity, running, cycling, swimming, weightlifting, some type of intermediate engaged sport like football, basketball, how is that going to affect my insulin sensitivity? Because now I'm going to have to inject insulin, and everything I do of every day is going to affect how much I have to give and how it's going to affect the most critical brain energy metabolite in the body, glucose. And as a result, if I accidentally take too much insulin, it could be very, very dangerous and also potentially fatal. And if I take too little insulin, I could quickly find myself going into symptoms of fatigue, irritability, lack of concentration due to the elevated inflammation and oxidative stress that comes with high glucose levels. And this was going to be the journey I was going to have to live for the rest of my life. But instead, I realized after about 2 weeks of straight, pure clinical depression, I saw an opportunity. I thought, I know bodybuilders abuse this drug. So if I have to take it for the rest of my life to just exist and not die, how do I learn from this? And if there's an opportunity to turn this into a win, I'm all about that. So I started thinking about optimization at every corner. Having obesity really made me be passionate about health and fitness. But getting type 1 diabetes turned it into a lifelong pursuit with extreme precision, extreme focus, because the consequences were happening at every meal, every activity of every single day. And so I looked back at my life and thought, what do I do? Because this is all I think about. And luckily, they pay people to think about this stuff. It's nuts. You wouldn't believe the fact that they pay people to think about this type of stuff all day, but they do. And I just so happened to pursue that career. It seemed like a great move.
Yeah.
And so here I am. I'm a research scientist a visiting research scientist at the Human Health Span Resilience Performance Division of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, which does a lot of Department of Defense work, have done some Special Operations Command work, NASA research, and otherwise. looking at some of the best performers in the entire world. And I've also work at Florida State University as a full-time research faculty at the Institute for Sports Science and Medicine, alongside another elite level researcher named Michael Ormsby, and others, Kyle Smith. And what we're really trying to do is understand how to optimize and more so maximize not just performance, but also health. And that's been my career. I've been in research for a little over a decade and a half now. So that's my journey.
That's an amazing journey. And you were in high school when all of this started, right? I mean,
Yep.
you said the obesity was maybe what, middle school, high school? From what I was catching?
It started to onset at the beginning of middle school, lingered
Okay.
into high school.
Gotcha.
My diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was in between my sophomore and junior year of
Okay.
high school.
Wow. I mean, what a journey, right? I love that because it drove you into looking at how can I not only manipulate this and control this for myself, but also how can I make an impact in the world, and maybe like you're doing, like research this, like come up with valuable, this is what we know, and maybe we can't use it yet, but there's more and more to know, which is kind of the topic of today, right? Is carbohydrates, right? We're talking all about carbohydrates because you're on a recent paper that got published that I'm sure has hit. I mean, we know as sport dietitians, this paper has hit the airwaves like no other, right? And I'm sure you're seeing it because you're on a ton of podcasts these days. But what caught our eye is, just to let you know, so decades. I mean, Dina and I have been practicing from the health and performance space as dietitians, right? Not performance and health, but health and performance, right? And we firmly believe if you're not healthy, you can't perform. So we need to make the body, the brain as healthy as possible. And really all of our work has been in the, how do we optimize blood sugar? How do we optimize insulin? So it's so fortuitous that we are here talking to you, the foremost expert on this, because let's circle back to your paper, because here's the thing we're talking about, listeners, today: carbohydrate feedings during exercise. Okay, there's so much to talk about carbs, but specifically, and I'll just say this: we are confused, Dr. Koutnik. Everybody is confused these days, right? We're confused. You might not be confused, but listen, our listeners are confused. When Dina and I go out for runs on the trail, whatever, like we're still confused, and we're qualified experts, I think we would say, right? Because there are so many messages with carbohydrate feeding during exercise. And this is where we'd like you to open it up. Like in the past, and I've been doing this for many, many decades, right? So this, but just for our listeners, the evolution of carbohydrate feeding during exercise has been more from I think a very lack of, I'm not going to say scientific evidence, but what we know is that science and research and real life sometimes match and sometimes don't, right? We know there's context. We know there's real life examples, sport examples, gender. We know all this, right? But where we started decades ago was the feeding of carbohydrates between the range of 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, right? Okay. A few years ago, that's gotten increased, 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour that we're kind of sitting at now in terms of the, let me just say air quotes, recommendations, right? But now we're seeing this huge push, which is crazy to us and hopefully you too. But now we're seeing the 90 plus, 100 plus, 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So let's start with this evolution, the confusion, and just like where are we? What is the messaging around this? And let's just pick your brain on where we're at right now with all this.
Sure. So to give a little bit of history to expand on what you're saying here, Bob, we knew back in the 1800s, the Olympic Games, and just looking at catering records of like what was catered to athletes during the Olympic Games and what there was consumed in cafeterias for the athletes, there was a very protein and fat focused nutritional strategy. Carbohydrates weren't zero, but it wasn't the focus of nutrition. It wasn't actually to the 1970s where there was pivotal shifts in the entire focus towards carbohydrates that has lingered and actually become even more emphasized with time. And why is that? Well, there was a really pivotal physician named Jonas Bergstrom in the 1960s who developed a muscle biopsy technique. So what does that mean for your audience? Well, this physician discovered how to take a syringe, stick it or stab it into your muscle
Yep.
and actually clip off a little piece of muscle and analyze what was in that muscle tissue. Well, what he found, and other researchers as well, is that, wow, there's glucose stored in this muscle tissue. So it must be important if you're storing a key nutrients for energy in the muscle must need this to perform. Well, lo and behold, they had actually found that if you consume more carbohydrates, that not only do you have more muscle glycogen, but you also perform better. You go for longer. Well, that started to pivot the focus towards, okay, now we need to fill the muscle pool, the largest muscle pool of the body, the muscle, as much as possible. Well, that was reinforced by studies in the 1970s and 80s by some prominent researchers, where they developed a new technique where they were measuring how much oxygen you breathe in and how much carbon dioxide you breathe out. So when anyone breathes in and breathes out, you're breathing in oxygen and breathing out CO2 or carbon dioxide. The ratio of how much oxygen to carbon dioxide is a established marker of how much carbohydrates or fat you are burning during your exercise. Now, keep in mind that these researchers were also finding that, wow, if you consume huge amounts of carbohydrates before exercise, well, no surprise, you burn more of them. But guess what? You also perform better. So it must be that the amount of carbohydrates you're burning is also critical to your overall performance. Now, this really cemented itself with a number of confirmatory analysis really showing an association by the amount of glucose stored in the muscle as glycogen and the amount of sugar or carbohydrates your body was burning at any particular moment as it relates to performance. I also want to make it very clear, it was never causally proven. It was always linked, but never proven to be the cause that someone is performing better or worse. Now, that didn't stop from every sports nutrition textbook in the 1980s and 1990s starting to illustrate the critical nature of carbohydrate in their texts by also developing things like modeling analysis, like the crossover point, whereas individuals were doing low intensity exercise, they would actually burn higher levels of fat and lower carbohydrate. But as you got to higher and higher intensities, you would cross this point where the level of fat becomes less predominant as a fuel source, and it becomes more predominant in carbohydrates as intensity rises. Also reinforcing this idea that any form of intense exercise, that you have to use carbohydrates as fuel. Otherwise, you can't perform optimally. Now, this really persisted throughout sports nutrition guidelines to the point where there were studies in the 2017s and 2021 from prominent researchers really doing really rigorous work, Louise Burke, John Hawley, and others, that showed that, okay, we're going to put people on these low carbohydrate-based diets for 5 days to 3 weeks in duration. And guess what? They performed slightly worse. Now, what I mean by slightly worse is it was a 2% reduction in performance in elite level race walkers, okay? Now, 2% for the average person is completely unnoticeable. You probably are never gonna even see these effects, but an Olympic level athlete, 2% is the difference between first and second place. And so that was very meaningful in that context. So that really, in many people's minds, and in fact, the name of the article was Nail in the Coffin, that carbohydrates were essential to performance. But here's one major kicker here, Bob, is that most of these major analysis failed to control a number of key variables that allowed for them truly to isolate out, was it the diet that actually induced this effect? Because the belief is that carbohydrates are essential to performance, and sports nutrition guidelines are pushing anywhere between 5 and 12 grams per carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day. So for an average body weight woman, okay, that could be anywhere between 350 to over 900 grams of carbohydrates per day. Or for an average body weight male, that could be anywhere between 450 to over 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per day. Okay, that is a tremendous amount of carbohydrates every single day. It's a tremendous amount. And the guidelines also emphasize, as you mentioned, these higher volumes even during exercise continuously. And the form of carbohydrates being consumed isn't the healthy type of carbohydrates that everyone recommends for you to consume, like fruits and vegetables. They are the most rapid, sugary-ish forms of nutrients that get into the body as quick as possible. So much so that they had developed drinks over a couple decades ago to allow for you to even get them in quicker by diversifying the formulation, so they could actually get through multiple receptors at the same time. So the idea was to get the glucose in as quickly as possible, to spike the sugar as quickly as possible. But there's some consequence to this. And so what's the potential consequence? Well, we know that glucose elevation also spikes insulin. We also know insulin is the most powerful hormone in all metabolism. I talked about this before. My body doesn't produce it. I have to inject it all the time. I'm keenly and personally aware of how powerful that hormone is. Well, we know that it also shuts down fat breakdown, okay? Dramatically reduces the amount of fat that the body can burn. So what then happens during exercise when you're shutting off one of the most important forms of nutrients the body can utilize? And on top of that, we know that some of the highest performers in the world actually burn higher levels of fat during endurance exercise. So how do we disentangle these seemingly discrepant pieces of information? Well, we had conducted a number of randomized controlled trials where we actually allowed for athletes to adhere to these diets for 4 weeks in duration. Why is that so important? We had known since the 1960s that when individuals do rapid induced forms of nutrient induced changes on the body, the most powerful of which is fasting. We know that even with fasting and how rapid it does changes metabolism, it still doesn't reach homeostasis in certain key biomarker changes, particularly metabolites that fuel the brain, for at least over 3 weeks in duration. So we know that there are ongoing transitions when adapting to the diet, of which are affecting the brain energy metabolism for at least over 3 weeks in duration, even when the stimulus is rapid. Well, there was another physician in the 1980s named Stephen Phinney who conducted this pivotal study in cyclists that showed that athletes who are doing low carbohydrate-based diets did see a drop-off in performance initially. In fact, he was an avid cyclist himself and would actually note to me, because I sat down and had dinner with him years back before we ran some of these studies, and he told me, Andrew, when I was doing these studies, I would ride next to these really high-level cyclists, and man, I initially, they'd blow right past me. I was in their tailwind. But around the week 1, 2, and 3 period, they wouldn't be in my tailwind. But when it hit week 4, all of a sudden they'd blow past me again. There was something about this timeline that not everyone completely understood. And there was a study by Walter Willett and David Ludwig, or a review, that actually outlines how many of the diet-induced changes are often 3 to 4 weeks or more in duration. And so what we wanted to do is remove that as a major confounding variable. We didn't want to study the transition into a diet. We wanted to study the adaptation that had already occurred on the diet, so we could actually test the diet specific effects. Many of these other studies, specifically the studies I talked about in the 2017 to 2021, they had actively increased activity levels. So they weren't controlling physical activity during diet change. Calories in many of these studies aren't always controlled. Body weight isn't always controlled. Diet adherence isn't always controlled. Well, we controlled all of them. We randomized the order of athletes that went onto these studies, in whatever order, high or low carb. We made sure that they washed out after 4 weeks on the diet to ensure that they had sufficient time to get back to a state of normalcy before they did the next diet. So we did all these controls that all these other studies had not, to actually test the fact of, if we shift just the macronutrients, okay, you just shift around the macronutrients, keeping the calories stable, keeping everything else stable, does the change in macronutrient or the diet composition actually affect performance? And when we did that, we found that when we asked athletes to go on a 6 by 800 meter sprints, 1 mile max effort time trials, and we did a follow-on study that was a little 2 weeks longer in duration, where we asked Ironman competitors to do this over a 2 to 4 hour ride. We saw that when athletes reduced their carbohydrates to less than 50 grams per day, that they had the same performance as when they were on higher carbohydrate diets, a higher carbohydrate intake, which illustrated this key question to us. This goes against everything that we're taught around sports performance.
Totally.
And if it goes directly against it, how is that the case? Because we had done some of those rigorously controlled studies there had been done on these diet-induced effects to isolate out the effect, and we're not seeing a difference. And so the question is, why is that? How is that possibly the case? Well, when you do your own studies, you should always be somewhat skeptical of them, because who knows, maybe it's something you did in your lab that you subtly changed something that may or may not have caused an effect. You don't always know, right? And so what did we do? Well, We went back and looked at over 100 years of evidence, over 600 different studies, over 160 different sports nutrition studies. And what we found was that, wow, lo and behold, it makes total sense. This whole focus on the amount of glucose stored in the muscle, the carb loading, or the amount of carbohydrates the body was burning was actually not the most reliable metric of performance. In fact, we had done studies specifically manipulating muscle glycogen levels and carb oxidation levels to lower levels and compared it to higher levels in the same athlete with the same genetics and same environment. And we weren't seeing differences in performance. But if those were the key drivers of performance, then we should have seen differences in performance, and we did not. What we were finding in this major analysis, and the most comprehensive to date on this topic, was that the primary predictor of sports performance was actually the maintenance of brain energy metabolism, the ability to actually sustain sufficient nutrients for the brain. And I think anyone can intuitively understand this, because anytime you think about someone changing, let's say, their psychology prior to a race, or changing something about the way they perform, if you don't have the brain, you arguably have nothing, right? The body prioritizes the brain almost everything else. So going all the way back to what we were talking about when we say if we give huge amounts of glucose and spikes insulin and block or shuts down fat oxidation levels, what we're going to find is that, lo and behold, the body is forced to break down muscle glycogen for energy in these scenarios. So it actually creates a scenario when athletes load up huge amounts of carbohydrates, thinking that this is going to top off muscle glycogen levels, thinking it's going to force higher levels of carbohydrate oxidation. What happens is it spikes insulin, which blunts and dramatically reduces the amount of fat the body can utilize during energy, and just dramatically shifts the actual nutrient from fat and carbohydrates to almost exclusively endogenous carbohydrates from muscle glycogen. You actually accelerate muscle glycogen breakdown during exercise with higher carbohydrate load, which goes directly against almost all the sports nutrition marketing push towards higher carbohydrate load, promoting it to actually maintain muscle glycogen levels, which it does the opposite in the most rigorous studies that have been conducted. So what we essentially showed in summary was that if the primary focus of performance is maintenance of brain energy metabolism, we found that the maintenance of brain energy metabolism is infinitely less in the amount of carbohydrates someone needs to consume during exercise. We found that just 10 grams per hour was sufficient to maintain brain energy metabolism through blood glucose levels. But if the focus, which I would argue has been misled towards muscle glycogen levels and also carbohydrate oxidation levels as the primary predictors of performance, if you focus on that, well, yeah, the average body weight female, it could be 300 plus grams of carbohydrates per day stored in the muscle. Males, 500 plus per day. So if you have to restore that every single day with high volumes of exercise, yeah, you need to focus on astronomical amounts of carbohydrates. However, if the focus is actually in brain energy metabolism and the primary predictor isn't how much glucose your muscle is storing as glycogen or how much is being burned at any particular moment, then it totally changes the conversation around what the fuel source needs to be and how much it needs to be. Because the thing that I think has been a big misunderstanding of this study is, oh, you're saying you don't need carbohydrates at all. This is like a promotion of low carbohydrate approach.
Yeah,
no, it's not. Those studies that actually showed equivalent performance in low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, all that's showing is the lack of essential nature of carbohydrates for performance. These studies, we've shown that at just 10 grams per hour improves performance, and the primary predictor of performance was brain energy metabolism, not muscle glycogen or carb oxidation. All that's showing is the dose you need during exercise is in question. Okay? It's not saying that carbohydrates don't have a role in performance.
Yep.
It's actually just saying the dose is in question, and it depends on the context.
Yeah. So this is interesting. And this, listeners, that was the biggest golden nugget ever, right? I mean, that you said that so eloquently, Dr. Koutnik, and gave us that history that was amazing. And all I could think about the whole time, not all the whole time, but I don't know. Yeah, obviously we're all familiar with metabolic flexibility, right? I don't know if you've heard of metabolic efficiency. It's a concept that I created over 20 years ago that basically is like, how do we use nutrition and exercise strategies to optimize blood sugar, insulin, right, for health and performance? And I could just think of that the whole time you were saying this, because early on when I was poking around with that substrate oxidation testing, which is now what I affectionately call metabolic efficiency testing, looking at O2, CO2 with the metabolic cart, I remember early on, I'm like, as I'm testing athletes and myself, and I'm like, listen, as I manipulate the diet to just periodize carbohydrate, not even like keto, but lower carb, right? We're periodizing carbs and increasing protein and fat at the same time, usually. What I found was these athletes in particular, and I'm not talking high level, I'm not talking Olympians, I'm talking people like all of us, right? What I found that they actually needed fewer carbohydrates during exercise. And it's so funny because this is what really resonated when I saw your paper. I was like, oh my gosh, here's the 10 to 40 grams of carbs per hour, right? It's in your paper. This is literally something I have been telling athletes for 20 years, Dr. Koutnik, is like, hey, that's not optimal. But when I see your diet adaptation to more of a fat oxidation state, where you're not basically, like you were saying, not dumping in all these carbs and forgetting about protein and fat, when we shift into that more metabolic efficiency state, they require fewer grams of carbohydrate during exercise. So I wish I could hug you right now because I would. Because here's the thing. Early on when I was doing this, people were always like, well, if you feed fewer carbohydrates, I call it gas tank, your muscle glycogen stores or your gas tank is less. So the question I always was posed as a sport dietitian was, that's going to reduce performance. I'm like, no, you would think it would, but I'm showing it doesn't. But I'm not a researcher. Like, I only had the N of one. I only had the anecdotal information. So what you're saying, what I'm hearing is there is a vast contrast between muscle glycogen stores, aka gas tank of carbohydrate, and brain energy metabolism. And perhaps we may have been thinking, maybe we just haven't expanded our opportunity to learn effectively throughout time. And I'm saying like in the past 10 to 20 years, and saying maybe it's not all about the gas tank. Maybe there is a blood glucose, blood sugar, brain energy metabolism piece to this puzzle. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I feel like this is what you guys have really paved the way for, is to have the opportunity to have that discussion and say, hey, maybe it's not just the gas tank. Maybe it's not just brain energy metabolism. Maybe we need to be talking about both of these. And of course, in context to everything in life, right? But you kind of feel where I'm going with this?
Oh, 100%. In fact, we've known since so we're not new in saying this, by the way. Actually, one of the first analysis ever conducted was in the Boston Marathon by Harvard physicians. These two Harvard physicians were looking at athletes running the Boston Marathon, and they were coming through the Boston Marathon. And these athletes were as reported in 1925 in the Journal of American Medical Association, one of the most prominent medical journals in the world. And what they saw was that athletes coming through were developing like lethargia, ataxia, meaning they were shaking, they had slurred speech. These are all signs of low brain energy availability, and they call a clinical term called hypoglycemia. And they actually analyzed what they call the constituents of blood in athletes during the Boston Marathon. And what they found is that these athletes had characteristically low blood glucose levels, even into levels that we know induce powerful stress responses induced by the brain because of the low energy. The brain senses this low energy and does everything it can to protect itself from that low energy. So we've known for decades the mechanism by which low glucose levels in the blood cause a brain energy response, what they call a neuroendocrine counterregulatory response, which induces stress, which also induces powerful hormones that drive shifts in the body. And all these shifts are for the brain to protect itself. Because imagine you're exercising. Imagine evolutionarily speaking, you're exercising and you're exercising for a long duration of time. And all of a sudden your body's like, oh no, we're losing critical fuel here.
Right.
Well, what tissue is going to be the most important? Is it the bicep muscle or the leg muscle, or is it going to be the brain? Well, it's the brain.
Yep.
Because, and we know this, the body has prioritized this biologically, because when you consume carbohydrates, the body elevates glucose levels, the body releases insulin. Where is the first place that insulin goes? It's not the muscle. Actually, insulin is released directly into what they call the hepatic portal vein. That is the vein that directly perfuses the liver. The body actually sends insulin to the liver first because the liver stores glucose and allows it to be released when blood glucose levels are low. That is a priority to ensure the maintenance of brain energy metabolism. Keep in mind that the muscle and fat tissue only see insulin in abundance, okay? Because the liver will steal 66 to 75% of most insulin that's released to store glucose in that tissue. It's only in abundance and excess where it starts to go to these other tissues and start to fill them up at higher levels, right? And so that is why the body has worked to prioritize and has told us for years, right? And biologically speaking, what's the most important thing for function? And we've known exactly how it actually shuts down and induces early onset fatigue. I have type 1 diabetes. One of the most important clinical symptoms or adverse events to avoid is hypoglycemia. Because it's compromised brain energy. You can't drive a car. You can tell you become fatigued. You can't concentrate well. If I were to get hypoglycemia right now, you guys will know. Everyone in the audience will know. You'll be like, something's wrong with this guy. Something's off. It's very powerful. And it's not like a subtle feeling of fatigue. It's like a profound level of I can't persist. Why that's so important is because it's our body's way of telling us what's the priority. Now, this gets into a conversation, though, about, you had mentioned here, Bob, about grams of carbohydrates and optimal levels. And this is where it gets into a very nuanced and interesting conversation, because a lot of the conversation has really focused on, how, okay, if you can choose whatever diet you want, because that's essentially what our research was showing.
Right.
And it shows that athletes have a choice. It isn't inherent that high carbohydrate diets are superior. In fact, in our own analysis, when we controlled all these variables and allow them to adapt to a diet for long enough, and it's the same person, same genetics, same environment, we controlled all the major variables we could think of, athletes were performing on average the same. Now, that's on short duration, high intensity efforts of sprint-based performance, 1 mile time trial max effort to 2 to 4 hours plus in ride time, sustained prolonged strenuous energy. But what happens when, let's say, an athlete is trying to find out, like, look, how many grams of carbohydrates do I actually need then? If I have any choice, well, the choice is really up to you. It's not so much a choice around performance. It might be a choice around your health and what's actually optimal for your health. But we also know, and this is a very important finding that we had out of our first analysis, one of our first analysis, not the first one, but one of our first, is that when we were giving individuals high carbohydrate diets consistent with sports nutrition guidelines, actually a little bit lower than that, to be totally frank, we were seeing that 30% of these athletes were developing glucose levels consistent with pre-diabetes. Now, that is incredibly important because we're not the only people to see this. In fact, one study showed up to 60%. Another study showed that it could be more like 10%. Generally, you don't really see it in like individuals who are like 18 to 24 years of age, although it's obviously not impossible for that to occur. Right. But it seems like there's a phenomenon in athletes who are in their 30s and 40s that as they consume, and some percentage of athletes are developing pre-diabetic glucose levels. And we know that macronutrients was a key determinant of those glucose levels because we controlled calories, body weight, physical activity, adherence to the diet. We just shifted around the macronutrients. And by lowering carbohydrates in the diet, they performed exactly the same, but completely resolved their pre-diabetes glucose levels. And so it illustrated that the athletes could perform the same, but actually could also improve their health. Because one thing that's also important to illustrate here is that this obviously illustrates that some individuals not only have to consider which diet is best for their performance, but also which diet is best for their health. Right. And we see in a performance context, because someone may ask the question here, well, why don't you just do why not just do a high carbohydrate based diet if it doesn't make a difference? Like most people are doing that anyways. Yeah. Okay, obviously there's the pre-diabetes component that some athletes are getting by following high carbohydrate nutritional strategies. But actually maybe even more important to some of these individuals, sadly, because the focus is so heavy on performance over health, is that we actually see that in our own analysis, that while on the average there's equivalent performance, on the individual level, there's diversity. Meaning that some of the athletes are going to perform better on low carbohydrate approaches and some are going to perform better on high carbohydrate approaches. So if we just assume that everyone should be adhering to a high carbohydrate approach, there will be a number of athletes that not only never achieve their optimal performance, because they never had the opportunity to explore an approach that might have been better for them, because we see this in our own analysis. But it
Right.
also introduces or inhibits individuals from taking a step that maybe allow them to choose a diet not for performance reasons, but for health reasons, of which some athletes need to do.
Do you think, Dr. Koutnik, that for those listening that are more health conscious and maybe in this older subset of athletes, no matter level of competitiveness or any of that, for someone who's hearing some of these messages and wanting to figure out, like, just reorienting themselves for their own fueling patterns, keeping in mind health impacts of potential, daily nutrition plans and so forth. I'm just wondering, for figuring out, or maybe fresh eyes on all of this, if someone's not working with a health professional in this case, would we use a CGM? I'm just keeping in mind like the brain energy metabolism and all of that. If I'm wanting to reset a little bit and not just look at the classic sports nutrition guidelines or the developing ones, but not go to no fueling, how would someone kind of start again to keep in mind, like, I want to still protect health, but I want to feel good in my workouts and adapt as an athlete to achieve my goals? Are there certain applications that you'd recommend? And I know that this can be context dependent as well, but I'm just thinking, because we went through a phase where athletes were using CGMs quite a bit, and then that phased out to a degree in, non-research settings. And then just thinking of ketone monitoring and some of these other, fuel gauges, lactate, and so on. So I just wondered your thoughts on that, maybe from the, like, being an athlete in the real world outside of a lab setting, what you might suggest there.
Sure. So a lot of the athletes that were utilizing CGMs for a period of time was actually because of a major push from a company called Super Sapien, who was able to bring that to light for many of the best athletes in the world, like the world record marathon time out of Kenya. They were wearing CGMs, Ironman championship wearing CGMs. So and they actually recently, I think, put like a halt to being able to utilize them from a sports advantage perspective, which that's very weird to me. But I think CGMs are valuable. But let me explain why. It's important to get a full assessment of your overall health. If you can get someone who's actually knowledgeable in this, even better, because they can actually look more detailed at your situation. If you're an athlete and you're willing to try to optimize, you're probably not, in some cases, you're just trying to get healthier, in which case just exercising at all is better than not exercising. Exercising more is better than exercising less. And then a structured program that gets to a specific goal can be a very valuable tool for a specific outcome or goal. But again, it's all along the spectrum. The individuals who are truly trying to, any one of these individuals can go get an assessment of their overall health and look to see, number one, are their blood markers looking well? Fasting insulin, fasting glucose, HbA1c, triglycerides, a typical clinical chemistry panel, complete blood counts. These are there for a reason, because they start catching things as they start to rise. However, we know that a certain tests like fasting glucose and HbA1c have limitations revolving them. And so they don't always catch subtle changes that begin to occur pre-onset of full-fledged diagnosis of a condition. In fact, we know that things like prediabetes can actually linger for years before you actually see subtle changes in glucose levels. And so actually catching this earlier on is much more important. But generally speaking, if you're maintaining a normal body weight, you're exercising regularly, and you eat good nutrition, then you're probably better than 90% of the population on the average. However, we have worked with athletes that as they get into middle age, they're even competing in local and regional events for running. They're doing high volumes of training, high VO2 maxes or total lean body weight, that 30% of them are developing prediabetes with high carbohydrate approaches. But we only detected that by actually using more advanced assessments that allow for continuous monitoring of glucose over 24-hour windows. So while they're sleeping, while they're not, every 5 to 12 minutes in duration, and over a 30-day window. Now, what that allows you to do is it bypasses the limitations of traditional tests that are limited by red blood cell count, like HbA1c, or the meal you had the night prior with fasting glucose levels, or the exercise you might have done 24 to 48 hours prior to an oral glucose tolerance test, right? This accounts for all that over an extended period of time, and then they can focus on their fasting glucose levels. Those fasting glucose levels are an illustration of what your overarching metabolism or basal metabolic state is in, right? Because it's in the absence of all these other confounding variables, like exercise, like the food you just ate right before. Those are going to change glucose and insulin levels and metabolism profoundly. So when you first wake up, that's why you get fasted labs, because fasted labs is in the absence of all these other confounders, is really your blank slate of your metabolic status. Well, that's what we were doing. We were actually looking at the fasted state of these athletes to see what their fasting glucose levels are. Now, that's a really powerful way to look at that in a more nuanced and microscope. With that said, I think it's about not just looking at your labs and maybe wearing a CGM to see how you respond and looking at your fasting levels as well, not just during performance or throughout the day, but actually when you're fasted as well. I think most people don't pay attention to that. You know, I'm sleeping, I don't really know whether that matters or not. Well, if your blood glucose levels during the fasted levels are above 100 milligrams per deciliter, that's a diagnosis for prediabetes. And people that probably don't pay any attention to that, but that's, I'll say this one more time. This is diagnosis for prediabetes. So having elevated glucose levels during that period of time in a fasted lab versus waking up in the morning, that is going to tell you if your metabolism is shifting in the wrong direction. And beyond that though, it's not just about lab work. It's about how do you feel? You know, if you're feeling lethargic, you're feeling like a lack of energy, there's probably other things that you need to consider here. It may be a diet change, maybe, and that's where you can explore these things and look at, you know, a detailed approach that's well informed. Because many people go into these approaches willy-nilly and just like blind. You're like, oh, look, I'm just going to lower my carbohydrates like I saw on the internet. Bad move. Bad move. You should be a well-informed individual who is actually trained or coach other individuals on how to adapt to these dietary strategies effectively. Otherwise, you're designing it to fail. Okay, or because it could be something very powerful for you, but you'll never know unless you design it correctly. Just like anything, right? If you design a training program to have way too much volume too quickly, you're probably going to get injured. You probably won't adapt appropriately. You're not going to get to where you want to be, more than likely. Same thing applies to nutritional approaches. So it's not just, it's lab work, but it's also not just lab work. It's how you feel, gauging your performance and how you're adapting to things. And don't just write it off as I'm getting old. Like, no, that is I think that's the same type of thing that was said in type 1 diabetes. Like, oh, I have type 1 diabetes. Like, shrug. No, you don't have to accept any of that. You should understand that there's probably an opportunity to correct or improve these situations. Don't just accept them as, oh, it's, you know, just getting old, because that's what typically you're going to be told if you go to a laboratory setting or a clinical setting. Why? Because they don't have an hour or two to sit with you to figure out your situation and meet with you weekly all the time. They have 15 to 30 minutes. They're sometimes put on a clock timer, and they have limited amount of time to manage a diagnosis, not to prevent it or reverse it once it's there. Okay? So that's a very different situation. When someone's trying to be optimal in their lifestyle, it's a very different strategy and or approach than it is when someone's trying to, let's say, just exist and manage an ongoing issue. That's a very different situation. I assume most of your audience is not trying to just manage or slowly progress into a worse and worse situation, but trying to optimize their situation. Everyone knows of the older person who's in their 70s or 80s. And there's plenty of examples. You see the sprinters, these guys, some of these guys are faster than me. And they're like 80, 90 years old. Like that didn't happen by accident. That person prescriptively worked to maintain that level of fitness level. Yes, as we age, we all, there's known changes that are going to come with that. However, you can certainly slow that down and or maintain so much function along the way. And that function also applies to your metabolism. And so you shouldn't ignore your nutrition as the most predominant way and most powerful way to change your metabolism.
I love that message, Dr. Koutnik, and so many of those things resonated with me, and I'm sure with Dina also, because this is, and our listeners know this, but it's like when you are exploring changes in your life, and I mean more nutrition and exercise related, specific to nutrition, but we need to undergo testing. And I can't tell you how many times we recommend this even in our episodes and say, hey, get some baseline testing done first. And that could be physiological, it can be a biomarker, it can be anything, because you need a baseline understanding of where your body's at first. then, I mean, I'm true to this nature. I'm my own guinea pig. I always dilly dally with things, but it's always around blood work testing, substrate oxidation testing, all this testing, because I want to see what is optimal for me. And that's the message I'm hearing from you is like, hey, just because like in reference to the paper that you were on too, is like, just because you guys did find that 10 to 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, I don't want to misstate this, could be optimal, right? We need to account for individual differences, but we also need to make sure that people are doing it correctly and not just throwing the spaghetti against the wall. And I kind of feel in relation to getting back to the carbohydrate per hour, I kind of feel like a lot of, especially endurance athletes, a lot of endurance athletes are seeing these elite endurance athletes pushing 100, 120 grams of carbs per hour and finding success, by the way, right? They're going through some gut training protocols. They're assimilating their gut. We understand this. They're consuming crazy high amount of carbs in their diet, their daily diet. They're seeing these guys and girls have success and they're trying to emulate that. And I think the message is, and this is what I'm hearing from you also, is like, whoa, put the brakes on. Like, we are all different, right? And Dina and I like to remind our listeners and our athletes, like, just because an elite athletes whose metabolism is very different, their physiology is very different from ours, just because they do it successfully doesn't mean, number one, it's correct, but number two, that it's actually going to have the same effects on us, similar to a training program. So I feel like what I've heard from you, the messaging is amazing. And it's not I'm hearing a lot on social media. People are, nitpicking your guys' paper and they're saying, oh, so now they're recommending 10 to 40 grams of carbs per hour during training. It's like, no, that's not what you're recommending. You're exploring perhaps it's more not just muscle glycogen related in terms of fatigue, in terms of performance. Maybe we do need to factor in the brain energy metabolism. And I say that jokingly because of course we do, right? I mean, I feel like you guys really brought this out and I love that to death. But I think in conclusion, as we summarize, Dr. Koutnik, what message would you send? Because there's so much, right? I mean, we could talk to you for days on this, right? Based on what we've discussed today, like what message would you give our listeners with all of this noise that's out there right now regarding carbohydrate consumption?
Sure. I think that anyone should follow a balanced approach, right? Balance is, if you give one word to health, it's probably the word balance, right? So finding a balanced approach, listen to your own body and try. Right? And no way to figure out something can work for you or not if you don't try. And when you do those three things, you have an opportunity to unlock a lot of potential in yourself. Because keep in mind, when we publish science literature, we're usually reporting the average outcome, not what Bob should do individually or what Dina should do individually to optimize their outcomes. It's what they do versus what I do might not be optimal because we have lifestyle considerations. Maybe we have kids. Maybe we have only certain times a day we can exercise. Maybe our sports are different. All these things, these change variables, right? I mean, on the average, we know that for resistance exercise and aerobic exercise, generally less than 60 minutes in duration for aerobic or resistance exercise, less than 45 minutes in duration for strenuous, non-strenuous forms of exercise. Carbohydrates, on the average, don't really do anything to improve performance. It's only when you get past this 45 to 60 minutes in duration and it's sufficiently strenuous where you see really any signal. And it's only really consistent when there's the potential for a blood glucose drop, right? Because all these dose response studies, there's been like 8 or plus more, they're not consistently showing an improvement in performance as you get higher and higher and higher. In fact, some of these studies actually show a performance decline beyond a certain level. Okay. And so actually like one study showed that 30 grams was similar to 80 grams. And once you got to 80 grams and you went higher than that, you actually saw a deterioration in performance. And so it was, it's nothing's for free here, right? And more is not always better. And just because in this concept of these elite athletes pushing these super high levels and someone's like, well, they're doing it and they're getting faster. Yeah, well, guess what? The mechanics of shoes also got way better reliably. Okay, those are known mechanical changes that induce faster performance without a doubt. Okay, we also know the training programs, the monitoring strategies, all these other nuance and advanced science is getting so much better. Do you really think the world champion athletes, the Olympic gold medalists, are the best in the world because the diet they ate? Okay, give me a break. It's not. Okay, and I'm saying this as someone who's super focused on nutrition. Nutrition is super important to performance. But do you really believe that the food that they ate was the reason they're the best in the entire world? It's the training they do. It's the psychology. And more important than that, it's the parents that they had. Okay, it's all those things combined plus getting the nutrition correct for themselves. Right? It's not, this funny comment came up where it was like, okay, well, look at the world championship Kenyan runners, and their marathon times are the best in the world, and they consume 70+% of carbohydrates, over 20% of sugar.
Yep.
And I thought, it's funny because like, what's the control group for that?
Yes.
Okay. The Kenyan runners who aren't as fast, who are doing the same diet. Do you really think it's the diet? Or is it because the Kenyan runners who are super fast are inherently unique, trained differently, and have better genetics? It's probably the latter. Okay. So like, we're not saying that low carb is better or that minimalist carbohydrate is better. What we're saying is that the amount of carbohydrates required is probably not as high as people actually think. The essential nature of it is absolutely in question. And it gives athletes a choice to explore these different options without thinking that they may be compromising their performance, with an opportunity to potentially improve their health.
Dr. Koutnik, I mean, yeah, like Bob was just saying a minute ago, I think if we had 2 more days with you, we could maybe get through the list of questions we wanted to originally go through. But you've given so much here in so many ways, I think, for, our listeners to think about. And honestly, it's exciting for us as dietitians to follow your work and to see how the research and the science is going to continue to inform from the application side, how we are working with our active and athletic people, and then keeping in mind the health behind that. So trying to protect your time as well. I think we'll have to see if we can plead and have you back for a second round here and honor the time that we have with you. Do you still have a few minutes? We'd love to do our high five segment with you to get a few more insights, a little bit more about you that we'll run through here. I'll just kick us off here. I was curious with your health and current athletics and all the other maybe some time constraints that you have. Are there supplements that you take?
I take creatine, and sometimes I'll do exogenous ketone bodies, because exogenous ketone bodies also are brain energy fuel and actually help restore brain energy if you go into hypoglycemia faster than if you just have glucose alone, and also help protect against going into hypoglycemia. So I actually utilize those tools as well, but I focus predominantly on creatine, and we've done a lot of studies with various exogenous ketone products as well. So and like for companies like Ketone IQ or one of these other groups or whatnot. So people can always explore that, see if it helps or doesn't help their own performance. And I don't really count this as a supplement, by the way, but I do drink coffee, decent amount.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so here's question number 2, because it was referring to that. But since you answered coffee already, I am curious to expand on the decent amount. How much is a decent amount?
I don't know, whatever makes you feel great. That's what I go by. So like, there's all this study that says like there's optimal amounts at like certain grams, like milligrams per deciliter. And then there's a potential that if you adapt to it, that maybe either way. All I'll say is that I enjoy it a whole hell of a lot. And it seems like there's not a whole lot of harm as long as you keep it reasonable and how much you're consuming. But yeah, I'm a dad. And so it's an essential part of my life right now. It might be its own macronutrient at this stage.
Well, that's so. I guess it's wrong to ask you how many cups a day. So I kind of feel I get the vibe. Okay.
So I get crucified for this, but whatever. I like to go to Starbucks once in a while. I used to make it at home. It's just an experience to go and get some. If you can avoid getting all these like plasticky cups and stuff, it's probably for the best not to do that. But whatever. So I typically try to stick to like a grande style, which if you look in the literature, it's all over the map. Like these could be 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine. I don't know. Some days a great day, Bob. Some days not a great day, and it's probably from the variability. But
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
What is a favorite sport that you might enjoy watching or maybe even binge watch? I know the Winter Olympics are going on, but I don't know if that's your gig or not. Do you have a sport that you enjoy watching?
Oh, that's a great question. I watch mostly jujitsu and mixed martial arts matches because I do it.
Oh, cool.
I think it's like I view it like chess and combat. Like chess, you have all these options and different nuances, and if you play this, then it leads to this from the other competitor. And so, but each person's like a different chessboard, but you still have the same options and moves with each new chessboard. And so I love I do jujitsu and I just love everything about it, what it does for you, the way it forces you to think critically in a compromised situation, and just the art of it. And you do it in a community, right? Like you can't do jujitsu by yourself. You
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
do it with other people. And so I mostly watch that just for pure enjoyment, but I'm also a big football fan. I'm a big college football fan. Never really had a major professional sports team because I just didn't have one in this hometown that I grew up in. But I'm a Florida State fan. First
There
and
you go.
foremost.
See
There
that?
you
Not
go.
just because I'm employed there, by the way. I grew up in this town. So, yeah.
Love it. Okay, question number 4. Have you added anything to your daily routine that has been different in the past few months? And that could be training related, nutrition related, mindset related, anything.
Yeah. Journaling first thing in the morning.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
I have the most powerful things that have happened to me in my life are typically changes in my own approach to life. And typically those come after a major event or a major shift in focus, whether it be, when I got married or had kids, or like I had some, when I lost my father. All these things, if you don't change, I'm good luck to you. But I
Yes.
recommend you be adaptable. I recommend that you make adjustments, because what I have found is that being mindful of yourself, being mindful of your place in the world, being mindful of where you're at psychologically, mentally, is incredibly important. And I find taking stock in that to start your day through things like journaling is probably one of the most an incredible asymmetric investment. And what that means is, like, that little bit of time you do there is an investment in your entire day. Just like when someone says, I exercise for 30 to 60 minutes per day, that's an investment of the remaining 23 and a half to 23 hours
Right.
of your day. It's completely worth it, in my opinion. So either way, that's something I included recently.
Oh, near and dear to
I
my
love
heart. Love
that.
it.
Well, our last question, Dr. Koutnik, which you may have already given us flavors of earlier or just even here a few seconds ago, but for all the athletes listening out there, if you had maybe one piece of advice that you could give to all of those athletes, what would that piece of advice be?
Stay curious about yourself and stay curious about what you do for performance. Because oftentimes, if you've been in the game for a long time and you stay persistent, it you stick to consistent routines that work extremely well. And I will say that it, it, finding curiosity in what you're doing, trying new things, exploring new options, can be a way to make it fresh every time you show up. Like, as an example, if I go into jujitsu with the mindset of, like, oh, I just have to go and do a class and we're drilling, or not drilling because we don't really do a lot of that. But if you're trying something new, a new technique or anything, and that's the focus. Instead, if you go in with intention and actually think about the things you're not good at and focus on the areas that you need to advance in, and specifically work on those key components, that in of itself can be a mini experiment that it totally expands your ability to make progress. And honestly, just to be honest, like, making progress in what you do is a huge sense of validation that the effort you're putting in is worth it. And so, yeah, you should focus on trying to get the best outcomes you possibly can when you're doing these things, because it does provide reinforcement in your journey along the way. If everything you're doing just feels like you're getting, like, for example, in jujitsu world is analogous to the rest of the world. If you just show up and get your ass kicked every single day and you learn nothing, it's going to be hard to keep showing up.
Yep.
But sometimes that feels like a part of the process. And as long as you stick it out, awesome. But you will get great one day. I can promise you that. But at the same time, it's also, I think, incredibly important for people to find enjoyment and think about what you got. Because if you don't quote unquote win, did you actually lose? Because the question is, what did you learn?
Yes.
Every tournament that I went into that I won, I don't know how much I learned from that. It's the ones where I got my ass kicked, where I thought, I'm going to show up and fix that problem, because I definitely don't want that to happen again. And so either way, so those sometimes the losses are the greatest steps forward.
Oh my gosh, what how great of a point to end on, right? I think I counted about 500,602 golden nuggets that you shared with us. And I lost count. No, but honestly, from the bottom of our hearts, this amazing Dr. Andrew Koutnik. I mean, absolutely amazing. You are such a wealth of knowledge, such a great human being, and just the time that we've gotten to know you. And listen, everybody who is listening to us, you need to look up Dr. Koutnik. Like, what he is doing right now in this space is amazing. And hopefully you've gotten the messages that, hey, he's not swinging one way or the other, right? It's like, hey, this is what we know. This is obviously, as you have said throughout, that it is an experiment. Life is an experiment. Nutrition is an experiment, but we need to know ourselves and we need to kind of accommodate ourselves. So one way isn't the only way. And I love that you're not like black or white. It's like, hey, let's figure this out. What is most optimal. So we just want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts for spending this time. Listeners, I hope you realize how much of a gift this was. And with all of that said, Dr. Koutnik, Dina, and I thank you. We would love to have you back on the podcast in the near future. I know your schedule is super, super packed because you are a super popular guy, but thank you once again for taking the time.
Well, it's been an honor, guys. I'm nowhere near as cool as Bob just said. Don't fall for that. I don't know where he got that information from, but definitely not the cool kid he said I was. But no, it's an absolute honor, guys. I absolutely enjoy this. It's cool because of the genuine passion you guys have for this. And so it's always really an honor to speak with you guys and explore these topics and to go into much greater depth about the work we do. So honor, cheers, and appreciate everyone, and reach out if you have questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Koutnik.
Thank you
All right,
so
guys.
much.